Good evening, and welcome to the YMCA of Greater Seattle's Y Community Conversation entitled The Gig Economy, the Great Resignation, and its Impact on Women. We begin by acknowledging the ancestral keepers of the land we gather on today. We thank them for their immense contributions to our state and local history, culture, economy, and identity as Washingtonians. At the Y, we are working hard on leading with love as learners. For us, this welcome is more than just a hello and introduction. It is where we all have a space to learn with passion, listen with good intent, and understand the depth and wisdom of those who have given their time and are opening their hearts to us. I want to simply thank each of you for this moment. So often we forget to give our thanks, sit in joy with one another, and love even the person we do not know. This Y Community Conversation is part of the Y series of events focusing on Women's Heritage Month and was created in partnership with the Y's Women's Employee Resource Group in collaboration with the YMCA of Greater Seattle's Equity and Justice Center of Excellence and made possible in part by our learning partners. We must begin today's conversation by understanding the woman's, females, femmes role of labor in the workforce. Our vantage needs to include not only the work that women, female, femme are doing during their actual production at work hours, but also the fact that women, female, femme are the very people who produce the workers themselves. In essence, if the worker is the one who makes the commodities, who is in fact then in charge of producing the actual worker themselves, and how does that play a role in how women, female, femme interact with the workforce itself? For example, how do systems dictate access to housing, clean water, healthcare, and food by race and class for the woman, female, femme, and where does that play a role in the types of jobs, pay, and reproduction of the workforce itself? Historically, we must look at the fact that women, female, femme were their own producers. Titi Bhattacharya shares the concept that the woman, female, femme naturally, prior to colonialism, created her own means of living. The woman, female, femme who produced her own form of living, food, textiles, education, needed to be separated from making their own means of living and begin relying on stores or systems to purchase or obtain the very goods they used to self-produce. Bhattacharya states, no one is going to go to a horrible 9-to-5 job, or increasingly many more hours than 9 to 5, if we had access to making our own food and leading our own lives. Becoming wage slaves for capital is not a natural thing. We have to be made into it. In essence, in 2022, people who have been systematically required to give up being their own self-producers now go to work in order to live. Therefore, when you see women, female, femme workers fighting for fair wages, it is not the wage itself that they are fighting for. Instead, is what the wage gives the woman, female, femme. And that is life itself. The gig economy is the most recent part of this complex life puzzle. The gig economy creates temporary and flexible jobs where a company, education, or nonprofit system hires independent contractors and freelancers rather than full-time employees. By 2023, the value of the gig economy will reach $455.2 billion. In 2020, US freelancers contributed $1.2 trillion to the economy, and the number of women applying for gig economy jobs tripled in 2021. Demand for freelance work has increased by 15% among younger workers, with 3 in 10 people saying freelance and gig economy work are their main sources of income. Our panel today will take time to share more on the gig economy, the Great Resignation, and its impacts on the woman, female, femme. Now I would like to introduce our moderator for the evening. Ray Reston serves as the Senior Director of Human Resources, Employee Services at the YMCA of Greater Seattle. She studied women and gender, African American studies, and multicultural education at Eastern Washington University, and has a rich background inclusive of working in both state, private sector self-insurance workers' compensation, human resources, and in education working with at-risk youth enrichment programs, and is well-versed in federal and state statutes. She demonstrates a compassionate leadership style that is centered on whole person health and has a passion for building efficient and supportive systems and processes from a human lens. Outside of work, she enjoys being actively involved in the community, reading, traveling, and raising her young son. Welcome, Ray.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining this evening's Women's Y Community Conversation to discuss the gig economy, the Great Resignation, and its impact to women. As the video has shown, we have some very important issues to tackle in relation to the gig economy. During our time today, we will look at the historical context in the workforce, the impact to the gig economy for those who are feminine on the feminine spectrum. Our conversation will be focused on how power of systems and power of inequity shape our experience of gender roles in the gig economy and exploitation of the female, women, and femme workers. Before we jump into today's conversation, let me take a moment to introduce you to our guest panelists for this evening. I am excited to start with our announcement today. We will have Shelley Stewart, who is our Director of Future Initiatives at Aspen Institute. We also have Dr. Lynn Nguyen, the Assistant Professor of American Ethnic Studies at University of Washington, and Whitney Archer, our Associate Director of Diversity and Cultural Engagement and Center Director at Hattie Redmond Women's and Gender Center at the Oregon State University. And last but not least, we have Dr. Kristen Drybread, our Cultural Anthropologist at the University of Colorado. I welcome you all, and before we dive into today's conversation, I want to create space for each of our panelists this evening to shed some light as to telling us a little bit about themselves. So Shelley, I'll pass it on to you.
Thanks so much, Ray, and thanks to everyone who's listening to this event this evening. Really looking forward to the conversation. So I direct the Aspen Institute's Future of Work initiative, where we seek to understand how work is changing and how we can ensure good jobs are available for everyone into the future. And if we, boil down the future of work to one problem or one question, it's how do we make sure that the jobs that are available are good jobs and that they're good jobs available to everyone, regardless of where they live, who they are, and anything else about them. So really looking forward to bringing that context and some of that research and experience into this evening's conversation.
Thank you. Dr. Nguyen.
Hi, so I'm an assistant professor in American Ethnic Studies, adjunct assistant professor in Gender, Women's Sexuality Studies, and faculty at the Southeast Asia Center. My research broadly looks at immigration and refugees and the global refugee regime, as well as intergenerational memory and history. I'm really looking forward to learning from Shelley's expertise in this conversation.
Thank you. And Dr. Kristen Drybread.
Hi, I'm Kristen Drybread. I am faculty of the Department of Anthropology at the University of Colorado Boulder, and I study the relationship between crime and race and class in the United States and in Brazil. And I have also had the dubious pleasure of having several jobs in the gig economy. So, and I have also been a reporting fellow at the Economic Hardship Reporting Project. So I'm excited to join this conversation. Thank you.
And Whitney Archer.
Good evening. Whitney Archer, they and she pronouns. As was mentioned, I direct the Hattie Redmond Women and Gender Center at Oregon State University. It's one of our 7 identity-based cultural centers, and I work with undergraduate and graduate students in that role, many of whom are connected with gig economy work or have roommates engaged in that labor. I'm also a PhD student in our Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies department at OSU. Where I study white supremacy in higher education, feminist pedagogy, and institutional change. And I think that those things intersect with whose labor is valued within the institutions that we work for. So looking forward to being with you all this evening and learning a great deal from my fellow panelists. Thanks.
Thank you all. Before we begin, I want to take some time. We're going to shift to some of the specific conversation and questions that we'll be diving into this evening to understand both the urgency and the opportunities to inherit in seeing the issues through an intersectional and equity lens. So we'll take about this next session, and each of the panelists will be able to shed light onto their responses to the questions, and then we'll move on from there. So our first question is, let's begin this conversation with an intersectional historical context of the workforce and those who are on the feminine spectrum. How has labor been shaped by those who identify as female, women, femme, and how are production of goods and services and reproduction of life integrated when it comes to work?
Maybe I can start with just turning to the work of Evelyn Nakano-Glenn and her discussion of both the development of citizenship and how it's constrained by race and labor, right? So in the United States, citizenship was made possible through both whiteness and the ability to freely sell your own labor, which is, of course, contingent upon whiteness in the context of slavery. She gives a really good illustration of how the development of industrial capitalism in the United States created a division of labor where the productive labor, which was usually done in the home alongside the reproductive labor, gets pulled out of the home. So you're no longer making the goods and services in your house. Now we're drawing men outside of the home to work for wage labor, and the reproductive labor remains inside the house, right? And so it becomes this devalued, unpaid labor, the labor of maintaining society and reproducing workers, whereas men's work outside becomes valorized and waged. So that's kind of the foundation. I'm sure that the rest of the speakers can add a lot to that.
I think I'll jump in and build on that. You know, the questions around the labor market and gender, and ideas about gender have deeply shaped both what society counts as work and not work and where that happens, as well as different types of work and sectors of work. So we have, you know, all of the work happening in the home, care work, reproductive work, that many don't even think of when they talk about the labor market or talk about work, but that is the work that makes all other work and all other economic activities feasible. It lays the groundwork for that to happen. And then within the paid labor that's happening outside of the home, there's strong occupational segregation by gender and by race to map onto, you know, wage differentials so that care work performed for pay outside of the home, but that is about caring, is providing care, disproportionately done by women and especially women of color, and also some of the most underpaid and undervalued work, and often completely excluded from what protections and regulations are in place. So we have a completely bifurcated labor market where careers and occupational paths that are understood to be more masculine lead to higher paying jobs and more stability, and jobs that are seen as more feminine and held disproportionately by women are undervalued, underpaid, and that happens along lines of race as well, so that the work most typically performed by women of color is the most undervalued and underpaid work, while also being some of the most essential work for the economy and society to function.
So I want to add, and I don't want to take up too much of the space, but that also that gender division of labor, in which men's labor was valued and women's was devalued, didn't play out the same way, of course, in Black families, Asian families, Latino families, right? So in the same moment where there's this development of a division of labor where there's a family wage and men are getting paid more and women are justifiably getting paid less because their wages are supposed to be supplementary to the family, women of color were always working, right? And so they were never considered people whose domain was only in the household, and actually there are very many racialized discourses of laziness when women of color weren't doing the reproductive labor and also doing wage labor outside of the home, primarily for white families.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about times of enslavement, right, and labor, the ways in which white male slave owners were raping the women who they owned, right, and with one-drop rules, then creating those labor systems and legacies and the care work that those enslaved women were providing for the slave owners' children, so that white women weren't working. The slave owner there, I think, is legacies we need to continue to contend with. And yeah, thinking about care work continued today and the ways in which women of color are doing the bulk of that work for white women's children.
And then I'll just create space if Dr. Drybread wants to go, and then I'll have a comment and segue into our next question.
I think that a lot of the ability, just speaking, going on in the theme of kind of the relationship of race and work, a lot of what facilitates white women to get ahead in the work world today is often their access to childcare. And, one can only lean in if they have children, if someone else is coddling those children for them, taking care of them. So a lot of the ways that work is currently rewarded and expectations for people for success are predicated around having childcare if you're a woman and want to compete with men in the workforce. There needs to be reproductive labor behind you and a whole system of support that we often overlook.
All right, thank you very much. And going into our next question, it says, do you see continued gender roles in the gig economy jobs? For example, do female, women, femme tend to do more domestic caring, writing, and translation work, while males/men tend to take on what is deemed as more masculinized roles, driving, transportation, specialist technical roles? Is there a pay gap that comes with the gender roles?
I'll jump in here. And when we look at gig economy work, there's the same occupational segregation that exists in the broader labor market. And we think of the gig economy and often think specifically of driving and delivery work arranged via apps, platforms. That's a relatively new way of arranging work. But there's a huge amount of gig work that predates that by decades and centuries. And much of that is work traditionally performed by women. This is care work, domestic work, a lot of arts and creative work, sex work. These are all types of work that are set under a freelance or contract model without the safety and protections of legal regulation, without minimum wages, without the stability or security that comes with a contract, with a longer term contract. And so those are very much a part of the gig economy, but not part of kind of this new emergence of platform-based work. We see the same segregation that exists in the broader labor market in the gig economy. So driving work, overwhelmingly men. It was that way before Uber was around. That's how taxi driving was. Care work and babysitting arranged via apps, overwhelmingly dominated by women. That's how it was before any of this was arranged via apps. When it comes to the piece about the pay gap, it's a little bit more complex or more nuanced, but the big picture story is the same, which is the gig economy isn't all that different, and the gaps that exist across the entire labor market are reproduced in the gig economy. The way that functions is a little bit different for different types of work. According to kind of the most recent research looking into this. For example, in Uber driving, women tend to make less because they drive during times of day where rates tend to be lower and are perceived as less risky times to drive, whereas men are more likely to drive at times when rates are higher and therefore their pay is higher. Those tend to be late night shifts that they're opting to work during. We also see that on platforms where workers are able to set their own rates. These are freelancing platforms like Fiverr or Upwork. Women tend to set lower rates, men tend to set higher rates, and that exacerbates the wage gap as well. So short answer, the wage gap persists. The mechanisms as to how that functions are a little bit different.
And if we have any others, I will go on to the next question, or did you have something else you want to add? Okay. What are the strengths in the gig economy model for intersectional by race, gender, gender identity, class, sexual orientation, age, and disability, female, femme, or femme folks?
I don't mind jumping in first again, though would welcome my fellow panelists to share as well. There's one of the arguments or one of the topics that comes up in conversations about the gig economy a lot is around flexibility and the ability to choose when to work and to not have certain work hours or certain shifts imposed upon workers by their employers or by their bosses. And there's growing recognition that this is really important, that workers need agency in creating their own schedules, regardless of gender, regardless of where they work, but especially for those with caretaking responsibilities who are disproportionately women. The problem with the gig economy is that flexibility is presented as a trade-off, that in order to have flexibility, well, you have to give up security and stability. When in reality, there are jobs that offer both, and all jobs could offer both. Any job can offer decent wages, adequate benefits, and some level of agency over scheduling. Myself and probably many in the audience have salaried positions that offer some level of security, some ability to plan, and also some flexibility over scheduling and which hours are worked. And that combination of security and flexibility needs to be made available to all types of work in all sectors so that the need for some scheduling flexibility doesn't come at the cost of basic labor protections.
And I think where I see also the messaging around flexibility is the assumption that it becomes your only job, right? That this isn't like a second shift or the language you hear around it becoming a constant shift, right? Of juggling multiple positions. So I think that has to be interrupted, right? That these messages, how do we look and frame it back to say, how do all jobs provide these things, as Shelley was saying, not seeing it as like a special case sort of deal. How do we have jobs that are compatible with the lives that we live and hold? And I think, being situated within higher education, the things that quickly became possible in March 2020 are very quickly becoming impossible again. Right. So it's like where we did get these lessons, we saw possibility and potential. Those things, we've reinstated systems of rigidity that I think are negatively impacting colleagues in my work and on the staff side of higher education who were leaving in droves and impacting students. But yeah, those are some thoughts I have.
No, I think Whitney, you hit on a very key point. I mean, going into COVID, the introduction of this level of flexibility or the potential of a new normalcy, how that we can operate in outside of normal kind of work hours that accommodate individuals' outside life. And now that we're coming from COVID and moving back into what is our new norm, there is more of some of these rigid practices that are being put in place to make kind of push us backwards to what was before COVID. And it seeming as if that's the only way we can operate. So I do see that that is a key point that needs to kind of be discussed, and then how it pivots into the gig economy model and why that is such a need to explore that as an opportunity and versus going back to what was instead of moving forward.
I think like one issue that, is a lot of people talk about is, and even that short trailer that was seen, at the beginning, was moving from the tyranny of a boss to a tyranny of the app. And the notion that, in the United States, at least, labor laws overwhelmingly favor employers and not the people who work. And so there are a whole bunch of, most people, whether they work in the gig economy or in many contract positions, work at the will of their employers. And so they can be let go whenever their employers feel the need. And under contracts, people, employers can decide not to renew the contracts. Just employers, the apps can decide how many rides you get, whether you get any. And much of the work that people end up doing is actually unpaid when they work in the gig economy. There's a whole slew of work that, goes into setting up, whether you want to set up your own, editing business and be your own boss. Well, there's a whole lot of unpaid labor that goes into that. And if you want to drive for Uber, there's a whole lot of unpaid labor that goes into sitting around and waiting for a ride that's not compensated. And so in some respects, that notion of flexibility is an illusion, at least in the model that we have now. Right? You're flexible, you're supposed to be flexible for your employer, but the flexibility you have is actually limited by what's available, right? If you want to make money working for Instacart or something like that, you might, enjoy that you can choose the hours you wish to work, but if there's no work available during those hours, it becomes very difficult to sustain a living and support yourself.
Dr. Nguyen, did you have any additional points?
I think everybody said it pretty well, but I think the question is flexibility for whom, right? So I think that there are these terms that we just kind of go, oh, that sounds great. But if it's flexibility, flexible accumulation, so it's how can capitalism find more ways to extract, time and value from you while investing less into taking care of you, then we have to consider like, who is it flexible for and who's benefiting from the flexibility? I think it probably benefits one very, very small sector of people who can choose to work if they want to, have a social support network, have healthcare, have somebody supporting them, have those basic needs met, and they want to make a little bit of money. That's probably a benefit for a small sector of people, just in the same way that the shift to remote work was a benefit for certain people of a certain class, right? So we froze student loan debt, interest rates dropped, houses around Seattle doubled in value. And if you didn't make, a certain amount of money, then you were really screwed, and you continue to be screwed during the pandemic. But if you're wealthy and you had the down payment and you can afford to buy a house because you don't have to pay student loans, right? Like there's these moments where it probably benefits somebody, but it's not democratized benefit. It doesn't benefit everyone equally.
I absolutely agree. One of the big things is, how are we defining flexibility? And it's absolutely not a one size fits all approach. And what's flexible for one entity or one organization may not be defined as the same as another. And how do we go about conversations in organizations or just in our daily lives? Like, how can we accommodate that flexibility need? And you made some key points as to when we shut down and a lot of people moving outside of Seattle or moving further away in a remote status. And now that we're coming out of the pandemic, and that flexibility is being removed, or it's being continued to an extent, but it's creating an impact on a lot of individuals that their lives have shifted throughout these 2.5 years, and how to continue with workforces without that level of flexibility that was once possible. So I think that is great kind of points that everyone touched on and how it intersects and impacts a lot of other things outside of just the gig economy model, and how do we adapt and how do we move forward. My next question that we'll kind of segue into are what are some immediate steps that attendees and our large community can support female women, femme, in the workforce, both in production and reproduction?
And some of my immediate places are like, how are we voting? What sort of policy things are we creating, right? Because a lot of these, like, even the ideas of being an entrepreneur and like these flexibilities are very individualistic, like kind of neoliberal solutions, right? And we need to really be looking at what structural change is. And I think local level civic engagement and voting can go a long ways, right? How do we claim agency there with our voices, and even trying to expand voting rights and access, like the ways in which we've seen so much gerrymandering and other things happening politically, like how are we disrupting those things to bring more agency and voices to the table and in policy development. So I think sometimes that can feel really big when we're thinking like over in Washington, DC, right? Like, but how do we do that on a local level, right? Like, what am I thinking about with who's on city council in Corvallis? Like, we're a relatively small town, but those do impact lots of things, like for me and my children. And so I think that local level engagement is the place to really dig in, and to me helps it feel more doable versus feeling like this massive thing and what's Whitney's little voice in the conversation.
I think there's also an extent where, you know, realize that things that are cheap and convenient for you do cost someone else somewhere down the line, right? And so kind of rethinking our spending habits, our consumer behaviors, who we shop, where we shop, you know, how we help contribute to the economy and help contribute to reinforcing certain models that only privilege the few at the expense of the many. I think that's an important thing that we can all do individually. Another thing I think we can all do is talk about pay. In the United States, it's shameful to talk about, you know, making low wages or being exploited. The only people who really show off, you know, and talk about what they make are people who make tons of money. And so we get this kind of Instagram version of what people are making, which is not an adequate reflection of our economy and what people are bringing in. So I think people being honest about what they make, because that information helps other people also demand more, and it draws attention to when some people are exploited. Drawing attention to that may not feel good, but it actually allows other people to realize how the system works for everyone. If we stay silent, we kind of allow exploitation to continue.
I'm going to add my bit because I'm really interested in what Shelley has to say based on research. But we need to unionize. We need to come together. We need to build institutions together. I mean, if there are way more women, I think we have to be honest about, you know, in response to Clarice's statement of treating women as people. Well, one, we need to recognize that this is actually happening, right? Like particularly people who are caregivers. And so a couple of people mentioned that they have children, and I don't know how you have children, because how do people pay for childcare? Like, I don't know how people do it. And this is not a conversation that is really happening in a meaningful way that talks about how financially impossible it is for people to do any of these things. So we need to admit that, you know, as a group of people, there's something that is systematically happening to us that we can change, instead of individually saying, how can I work harder, or how can I employ my family members to do free labor for me so I can keep being underpaid to do labor for other people. But unionize. I think we need to build these structures ourselves, and there are more of us than there are Starbucks workers, and the Starbucks workers figured out how to do it at 19 years old and things like that. So we need to fight for the labor conditions and the social safety that we require to, you know, to not have to constantly be in survival mode.
Yeah, I think the other panelists have really put forward the range of action steps to take, from, you know, through policy and voting, supporting the leaders and the policies that are good for all workers and good for women, strengthened safety net benefits, paid leave programs, strengthened labor protections and regulations, enforcing misclassification, expanding protections and rights to all workers and especially domestic workers. Washington State and Seattle specifically has some of the most forward-thinking legislation when it comes to domestic workers' rights. So continue to build on that momentum. Unionizing and working in your own workplace is crucial, and that also can be combined with Kristen's suggestion to, demonstrate through your consumer choices, support workplaces that do provide adequate wages to their workers, that do, that are employee owned, that are unionized, because that is, showing through your daily interactions, daily consumer practices, what you value and what you prioritize, recognizing that unionized workforces are more equitable by gender and by race. Though that's not always been the case, there's been huge strides within the labor movement to get to that point.
Oh, absolutely. And in the labor workforce, I want to see, how do we amplify that? Like, it's more so, how do we amplify the employee voice and actively listen to their perspectives and putting them into practice, or explain what aspects of the employee voice are we going to be able to move forward with, and here's the why. Showing that we're listening and showing that we're taking the initiative and taking steps to work with our communities. And that's what it takes to become a unionized organization. And so I do definitely agree. I want to go back to dive into a little bit of one of our previous questions, which is, are there strengths in the gig economy model for intersectional work that impacts our female, women, and femme folks? We can also discuss kind of what are the strengths and disadvantages, or some of the setbacks that they may encounter.
Yeah, so another one of the possible strengths, the piece around flexibility we touched on earlier. There's also this possibility to kind of present oneself with a blank slate, to not be presented in the workplace context of a specific role where we know that sexism and racism deeply shape workplace interactions and pathways to promotion. So when tasks are selected and workers are selected for those tasks on an open platform, that can reduce some of the ways that racism and sexism can shape kind of who is given what opportunity. That is a potential, it's a possibility. It's not fully realized, and there are still many, many ways that pervasive inequalities and injustices can shape how those jobs and tasks are assigned. Thinking of, just the pay piece that I'd referenced earlier, where, workers are putting forward their rates, which are based on their own experiences. And I'm recalling, I don't remember which of my fellow panelists referenced the importance of pay transparency. When we're not really clear about who's making what, that's how wage gaps get reproduced. But there is this potential in gig work to kind of have a more equitable starting point when it comes to presenting opportunities to workers.
I just want to say, related to that, I feel like, and this is just a kind of personal anecdote, but people who, for example, went on the academic job market in the past 2 years, if they were pregnant, they didn't have to conceal their pregnancy, so they didn't have to deal with that kind of discrimination, right? So, and I think it's related to what Shelley was saying about, it's kind of the benefit comes from being able to hide from systematic inequality, because people can't gender you, race you, decide what your sexuality is, and they can't discriminate against you yet. So it's a benefit in this kind of twisted way of trying to navigate reality as it exists, right?
Yeah, I think there's those potentials and possibilities, but it's hard for me to wrap my head around in our current structures, right? Like, how are we also investing in healthcare, in, like birth to 5 care for folks? Like, though, I think we have those stronger social structures in place, how we can actualize possibilities and potential in the gig economy change, right? It just becomes because there's individual labor, right? But there's, whether someone is driving for Uber or selling, monetizing their hobbies on Etsy, like there's still who is making the money at the top of that infrastructure, right? And so how are we, I just always go back to looking at systems place and like, what are the structures we need to reimagine and rebuild and to get to be able to actualize some of those potential pieces that aren't just looking at like individuals, right? Like I think that's the power of unions and like building a collective and why that's so important as a part of this.
There's an extent to which the people who tend to thrive most in the gig economy are those, I think that Dr. Ning, you mentioned this before, those who have resources behind them, right? And so if one already has childcare set up, if one has a place from which to work that is stable and safe and clean and allows them to devote time to work, if one has conditions where they have time to actually devote themselves to their work, so they're not doing 27 different things at once, but can actually do the work that makes them proud, and they can build from their gig work something that they're proud of. But the people who are most able to build those kind of foundations from gig works are those who already have a tremendous amount of resources behind them. So something like some have said that like a universal basic income could build the foundation for many people to kind of break out of the marketplace and kind of become independent workers who are actually able to survive. But the only people who are able to build those kind of careers already have support systems behind them.
And I will just piggyback after Dr. Drybread. It's more so taking that leap and to the potential of a gig economy. And then as gig economy continues to grow, data analysis. So I'm huge on data and watching for trends and seeing how we can further capitalize this and make it a larger opportunity. But that's going to take from the general labor force market, because as soon as they see the more broader potential and allowing for a stabilized work environment that accommodates their flexibility needs, they're allowing themselves to break out of what's the standard labor workforce environment. It's going to be a shift. So I do think there's a lot of potential, and it's more so how are we balancing the spectrum, because I do think there is room for both. And an individual can continue in the labor workforce market and take on gig economy work. But if they decide to make that shift because the gig economy model allows them the flexibility and they're able to gain the resources, the networks, and the stability they need, as well as some of the healthcare that's more comparable or comparable than their needs than that their current employer, it may be more favorable to that individual. So the data would be very, exciting to kind of dive into and look at that over the years.
I completely agree. And I think something you brought up that's really interesting is that relationship between working to live or living to work and what we want to do, right? And it's interesting that in many kind of emerging capitalist economies, people would work just the amount that they needed to make the money they needed to get by. And employers were flummoxed by this because they thought, wait, if I offer you more, you'll work more. And actually people, if they were offered more per hour, they worked less because they decided that, no, once I can meet my needs, I'm good and I'm going to go live. And I think we also need to kind of change our attitudes about that relationship between work and life as well, to think through, well, when is enough? What are we living for? What are we working for as well?
And what does your work-life balance look like? And, I've had individuals that I've encountered because I oversee compensation a lot, and some don't favor going from hourly to annualize the salary because there's that additional layer of opportunity to take on overtime and what have you. But if you go salaried, there's this expectation you don't get overtime. It's just kind of you're expected to take on the work. So I do like really being transparent and vocal about how are we reinforcing work-life balance? Are you living to work or working to live? And what are the steps what are the resources that are needed for you and the steps for you to take into account for yourself on what your needs are? And then I will go on into our next question if we don't have any more points on that one. Okay, are there any other immediate steps that we think in the community that we can take, or larger communities, to support the female femme and femme women workers in the workforce? We had another question from Indira. It says, what is micro work, and are women affected by the common corporate practices of micro work?
I don't study labor, so I'm not familiar with this term. Indira, can you define this word for us?
I was just curious. It's a new phenomenon that I had heard about, and it's this idea of paying $1, like from 1 minute to 20 minutes of work that people hustle for. And oftentimes corporations, like, for example, if you think your Uber driver is actually being like, does the picture of the Uber driver match your Uber driver? It's actually a person who has 1 minute to be able to say whether the picture of the Uber driver matches the Uber driver. And if that's the case, and oftentimes if they get it wrong or they're not fast enough, corporations are saying, as all of the panelists talked about, corporations are saying like, oh, well, you didn't do a good enough job. So they're actually not paying them for their micro work at like over 30% from what I understand. So I was just curious if like that's something, it seems new, but it seems like it's going to be an up and coming way to, and NGOs are really pushing micro work too, for women in the global South and in the United States and North America too. So I was just curious if anyone knew more about that.
Sounds like people keep finding more flexible ways to fuck up the lives of people, women of color in the global South, right? I think like I can't imagine they can make it worse. They can keep making it worse. So.
Yeah, I was also not familiar with the term micro work, but based on that description, it sounds very similar, if not the same, to what people have called, cloud-based gig work. Mary Gray wrote a book called Ghost Work, referring to this type of work, which is, it has shown to be incredibly exploitative. The pay rates are incredibly low. There's often all of these workarounds and excuses that the task givers, employers, although they're not legal employers, can use to just avoid paying workers altogether. And this work is, it's outsourced all around the globe. It is often performed by the people most in need of an income, and is incredibly exploitative. I would suggest the Fair Work project out of the Oxford Internet Institute does a lot of work rating working conditions of in-person gig work in a range of countries, as well as online cloud work. And they have an annual report on this type of work and some of the platforms and their practices. So would encourage folks to check that out as well to learn more.
I think the question is a good one to kind of bring back the intersectional framing, right? So we have to think about what are the conditions that make it so that earning $1 for 1 minute of work in the global South is something desirable, right? And so looking at histories of colonialism, empire, and capitalism that makes specific populations vulnerable to this kind of work as like the only work available to them is an important way to think about it. That allows us to kind of undo any sort of neoliberal feminist propaganda that says, look at these women, they can earn money for themselves, right?
And any other points? I'll allow a few more moments just to kind of give any other feedback. A lot of rich feedback. I definitely wrote my notes, Shelley, because I thoroughly love reading up on articles and studies to just get more familiarized with other practices that we can kind of review in comparison to our own.
as someone that doesn't study this, like even just calling it micro work sits some sort of way in me, right? Like this micro, and what we're putting is like a value just inherently in how it's being talked about. So that's sitting in me and hearing that as someone who it's not a term I've worked with before. But I think the question you posed around like other things or strategies, something I've tried to think about is like how to make work legible. I think so much of feminized labor, so much of care work isn't legible, right? So even trying to find ways to subvert within the institution, right? Like how do we bring that labor into things that become CV or resume legible, to help folks move through promotion and tenure processes. And that's specific to the academy, but I do think there are ways like, how do we make the work that's happening more legible, right? Similar to Dr. Draybread's conversation around like talking about pay, right? Like how are we just bring things out into the open and discuss them, right? Versus leaving things hush hush. I think that is a starting spot for so much of the work that we need to do, is being open and transparent, and again, making that legible.
I think we have to be conscious not to ask women to do free labor. All of the time, people, and especially women of color asked to do extra diversity initiatives or asked to give extra support and care and advice. And while that is invaluable work, it is nonetheless work that should be compensated, not only in thank yous and hugs, but in other ways as well. So like being aware of the many subtle ways we ask women to provide free labor, I think is something that we also might, be conscious of and be aware of and try to stop ourselves from doing.
Very good point. So I will go ahead and transition us. We've had a very rich context and conversation this evening, and I want to give a warm thank you for joining us all this evening for the gig economy event. We hope that the WISE community conversation on the resignation and its impact to women has been meaningful for you, and we invite you to share your feedback with us on the link that will be provided in the chat box. If you could share one word to express how you feel about today's conversation, or a quote that our panelists said that really resonated with you, please share with us in the chat box. If you're interested in additional resources, information about the gig economy, we invite you to watch The Gig Is Up documentary by Sharon Walsh that is now available on YouTube. And if you want to get involved, explore the Gig Workers Rising movement that supports better wages, working conditions, and respect, and the Los Libretistas Unidos, LDU, which supports immigrant delivery workers fighting for justice. We invite you to our future-wide community conversations in May as we explore the Asian American identity crisis and its impact on mental health on our young Asian American youth. This will be part of our Asian and Pacific Islander Heritage Month offering, which are free and open to all. We hope you all will join us at the next event, and we thank our partners that were partnering in this work to host the Gig Economy event. Thank you and have a wonderful evening.